Hey everybody, thank you so much for coming, and I may get some water. And it's my first time here in Durham, so it's been lovely to have arrived on a day as beautiful as this. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of the kind of work that we do, which is work around using these new tools, particularly digital tools, to mobilize and organize people in a human rights context, although the work that we do extends beyond the human rights realm. And so I'm going to do some storytelling. We're going to show you some examples of our work, and then we'll do some Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to engage with some of the kind of underlying theoretical questions and practical questions that arise. So anyone know who this is to get us started? Aha. So Anna Hazare, he is an Indian, Gandhian sort of anti-corruption social justice activist. He's not the person that you would think of as a digital activist, right? He's the most traditional activist. You know, he's doing hunger strikes, the repertoire of tactics that are used in places like India. However, Anna Hazare became a very compelling digital activist recently. In 2011, during his anti-corruption campaign, he asked people to do something that might seem unusual to some of you here. He asked people to leave him a missed call. Does anyone know what a missed call is, other than the apparent literal meaning? Okay, so if you spend time in the developing world, you'll discover that in order to avoid phone charges, a very common practice is that people leave each other missed calls. So if I'm running late, I'll leave you a missed call to let you know that I'm on the way. If we're dating and I just want to say that I miss you, I'll leave you a missed call. It's the cultural context in which hanging up on people is acceptable. And the reason people do it is because it means they don't have to pay for stuff using their mobile phones. So Hazare is experimenting with a way to engage people in his campaign to try to get people to protest everyday corruption in India, and he asks them to leave him a missed call. Does anyone want to guess how many missed calls Hazare got? This is where some courage is needed. Okay, I'm calling the guy in the hoodie.
Say 5 million?
He got 35 million missed calls. So this is pretty significant as a fact, right? What it means is that 35 million people in India took this action, which enabled Hazare to, really build a massive movement. He used those 35 million phone numbers to turn out huge numbers of people on the streets in Delhi. And it's a signal. It's an important signal. What does it signal? One signal is that it shows there's this massive, emerging, mobilized, ultimately becoming middle class in places like India that are politically mobilized, that have mobile phones, which are an incredibly powerful tool for activism when used effectively, and that want their power to be realized. So to give you a bit of a flavour of what we do at Purpose, which is the organisation I run, which is headquartered in New York, but also has offices in London and Brazil, we create tools for movement building, and we help to launch social movements. So in response to Hazare's success, we created a tool called CrowdRing. Now CrowdRing basically solved the problem that Hazare had after he got 35 million missed calls, which is that Hazare kind of effectively had the world's longest Excel spreadsheet, right? He had 35 million phone numbers. He had no back end. He had no means to really segment or engage those people. He couldn't use that to start a movement. He sort of hacked it together and was able to contact the people whose numbers were in Delhi, which is how that protest came together. But what we built was a back end to enable anyone, anywhere, all over the world to start one of these missed calls campaigns. We went and we did these negotiations with telcos, and what we now are able to do is run missed calls all over the world. So this is an example of a campaign that we ran recently in Kenya. Missed calls, by the way, there's a whole slang around them depending on where in the world you are. In Kenya, missed calls are called flashing. And we ran this campaign against a tax that was on basic foodstuffs that was going to disproportionately impact the poor in Kenya. we had to do some work initially with groups on the ground, finding a way to kind of rebrand and reframe that issue. So we called it the Unga tax, because Unga is a word that means kind of basically maize, and it was a way of translating what was a kind of a fairly complex, inaccessible thing into something that was enough to stoke popular focus and interest. A bit like the way Republicans here recast the inheritance tax as the death tax. It's a very effective tactic. So we ran this campaign, and then people all over Nairobi just sort of promoted the campaign. So what do you do in a world in which people aren't sitting around on their laptops? Well, we had people just go from village to village, town to town, wearing this stuff. People went to soccer stadiums for soccer matches. Garbage collectors in Nairobi actually went door to door on their rounds, explained why this tax was a problem. They'd been trained by activists, and were then able to get people just to, because everybody has a phone, right, to use their phone to leave a missed call. And just recently, this is only a few months ago in Kenya, we got 250,000 people in Nairobi in this little pilot to leave a missed call. That was the beginning of a movement against the Unga tax, which actually resulted in the tax being dropped from the broader VAT bill that was being pursued by the government. So it's just a little example of this new, highly empowered and able to be mobilised community of people in countries like Kenya. So there is a shift going on, and this is the work that Purpose does around the world, which is that people are beginning to sense their own power. And you see it in many examples where the fact that the internet allows you to see that your participation is embedded in a larger context tends to produce a lot more participation and tends to embolden people. So let me give you a bit more context on how I came to be doing the work that I'm doing. This is an organisation, not this organisation, but this is the problem that the organisation was trying to solve, which is sort of essentially the problem at the transnational level, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, which is that, globally there are great mechanisms for governments to coordinate through international institutions. Corporations, of course, are very transnational. But if you're trying to sort of organise global public opinion transnationally, that's quite hard. And as we know, the nation state isn't always the best way to capture the views and values of the world's people, which is why we've failed to get much global action on issues like climate change. So in 2007, I got together with a couple of other people and co-founded a group called Avaz. I don't know how many of you have come across Avaz. So Avaz is a big online global community. It's now got 35 million members. So it's the largest of its kind. And it's basically a way for global public opinion to be aggregated and mobilised rapidly at times of urgency or crisis around a whole set of issues. It operates in 15 languages now. This is an example of some anti-corruption work that we helped to bring about in Brazil. So all of that led me to create, and a bunch of other things that I did, which I won't bore you with, led me to create Purpose, which is essentially a home for these kinds of experiments in large-scale mass participation and movement building, where we identify global issues around which movement building of this kind, that is rapid, that is nimble, that is not in the mode of a traditional NGO, that can do new forms of storytelling, and we create movements around them. And so I'm going to tell you some stories about the work that we do, and we're going to give the talk rather a gay flavour, but there will be some things talked about other than LGBT rights. So let me give you some examples. So this is All Out. All Out is a group, I don't know if any of you have heard of All Out, some of you may be members. So All Out is a group that is trying to do this at the global level for LGBT human rights. So basically, why did we create All Out? Well, we sat down at Purpose a few years ago and we said, what does the LGBT space look like? Well, in places like the US, you've got lots of, frankly, gay, rich, white men who are funding advocacy around marriage, which is going really well. And that's probably, I see there are some big fans of that approach here in the room. That's probably not where we need to intervene. That's where all the money is, that's where all the focus is. There's a whole bunch of people whose rights, aren't being obtained, who are highly motivated to obtain those rights. But then we looked at the broader picture. And if you look at the broader picture, you've got a real crisis around the world, where despite all of the money going to getting, gay guys like me married, actually in Uganda, in the Middle East, in many parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, the list goes on, there's a massive crisis. And in some ways, the problem's actually getting worse. So if you were interested in improving the lives and welfare of LGBT people around the world, you would focus there, which is why we created All Out. Because at the global level, there's very little money, there's very little effective advocacy, or at least there wasn't until All Out. There were a couple of groups doing sort of policy work at the international level, but to Jane's point, and we can talk more about this later, that policy work wasn't really cutting through, right? I mean, you could pace the halls of the UN a lot, but that doesn't always result in significant social change or improvements to the lives of people, nor does it bring about cultural change in many cases. And at the global level, there was also this challenge that the groups doing this work on the ground just needed help. They had very weak capacity. They were often in the shadows. Sometimes they weren't even allowed to operate by their governments. So this is an example of one campaign that we ran. This is Roger, and this is actually a pretty sad story. So Roger was sent to jail for 3 years in Cameroon for sending a text message to another man that said, "I'm very much in love with you." That other man was actually a police officer who was entrapping him. He was sent to jail, and unfortunately, and this campaign was run before this, Roger has subsequently died. He was out of prison, and this campaign sort of was part of the movement to get him out of prison. But obviously being a gay man in Cameroon is neither a safe nor a happy environment. So we ran an international campaign in solidarity with Roger. And part of the point is that if you want to attack the criminalization of love in these places, you have to do the storytelling around it. You can make the dry arguments about why it's wrong or why it contravenes human rights practices or norms, but at the end of the day, you have to find ways of making that story accessible. And Roger's story and the injustice of it was incredibly powerful. So this is an example of a campaign. Here's another one. This is a campaign that All Out ran around LGBT men, mainly in Iraq. So the situation for gay men or men who are seen to be gay in Iraq is pretty dire. About 800 of them have been murdered since the Iraq War, often with the tacit consent and in some cases the involvement of the police and the Interior Ministry. So these gay men who you see here, who are not showing their faces, were being targeted. They'd already been subjected to violence. There was a group of more than 20 of them that we'd identified that were in very immediate danger of being killed. And the problem is that a lot of the traditional civil society mechanisms for helping these people are actually a little bit slow and in some cases quite ineffective. So in this very real example, even though the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project had identified these men, there was no actual funding or ability to quickly get them out of the country. And they were in these long traditional foundation funding cycles which take a long time. And so All Out intervened, and again, we use this example to really help mobilize people. So in a very short period of time, we raised, I think it was about $100,000 in about 12 hours, which was enough to evacuate and resettle a group of these Iraqi men. And I think the moral of the story here is that when this work gets to scale, All Out now has about 2 million members around the world, it's able to be a very powerful source of funding for this kind of work that can be very quick and is, instead of relying on traditional philanthropic mechanisms, is based on micro donations. And secondly, is a really good way of calling international attention to a problem like this, which then becomes an important case study you can bring to other larger philanthropic actors who might fund that kind of work. This is some photographs from the work we're doing at the moment around Russia's anti-gay laws, where we've mobilized a lot of people around the world. We've also done some important work targeting corporations. Coca-Cola has been terrible on this, absolutely woeful. So, Coca-Cola is an Olympic sponsor. They had a real moment and an opportunity to kind of make a clear stand against the laws in the lead up to the Olympics, but they failed to. We're still working on them now, and we think that we can potentially get them to reverse their position. They're really lovely to LGBT people in the US. They treat their employees really well. They make ads that they air here in the US that feature gay people. But then in other markets where it's less economically kind of convenient, they're completely unhelpful, as they were here in the case of Russia. a lot of our work on LGBT issues is actually not just targeted at governments, it's targeted at corporations. Corporations are often a very important voice, particularly in places like Africa where, government voices, having the State Department condemn you isn't always so effective because of the sense of just kind of Western intervention or imperialism. Whereas corporate voices that can make an economic argument about foreign investment and about creating an environment that's economically competitive tend to be more effective. So we're spending a lot of time mobilizing corporate voices. We recently ran a campaign getting the telco Orange to drop its advertising from the Ugandan tabloid that had been publishing the names and images of gay men in Uganda, which is putting those people at really grievous risk. And this is an example of how, in the case of All Out, you're moving people from the internet to the real world. So using this 2 million person movement, we were able to mobilize recently protests in 34 cities simultaneously. As we understand it, one of the largest ever simultaneous protests on LGBT issues, with this really powerful, very affirming, very positive message that love always wins. So this is some work that we're doing domestically to give you a bit of a flavour for this. This is a lot of fun. So this is some work we're doing with the ACLU. So we have a partnership with the ACLU called the Purpose Plus ACLU Action Factory, where we create campaigns to engage people in ways that are very different to what the ACLU has traditionally done and to its traditional repertoire of tactics. So this is an initiative that we launched a couple of months ago called My Big Gay Illegal Wedding, which is a way of highlighting the injustices and inequities caused by the patchwork laws here in the US now that the DOMA decision has passed, but many states still don't have legal marriage. So we invited couples in states where it was not yet legal to be married to stage iconic protest weddings across the borders in the states where it was. So you might hot air balloon, you might canoe across the Columbia River, depending on where you are. And we had this incredible response that proved to really be a wonderful way to tell these stories. Over 400 couples who were engaged, living in states where gay marriage was illegal, entered the contest, which blew our minds, because this is kind of a niche category, right? You have to be gay, you have to be engaged, you have to be in a state where it's illegal. There were many limiting factors. You have to be prepared to embarrass yourself in this way. And we had this incredible outpouring, and we just actually found the 5 winning couples, and this is one of the winning couples who actually made this video in order to enter the contest. It's pretty cheesy.
Okay, I have a couple of surprises for you, and I wrote a note for you. What the hell? I have a few confessions. These people here, who we met 4 years ago, they are not here by chance. The cameras in the video are not here by chance, as I hired them for us, and I wrote the letters that came with them. The list activities that we're supposed to do, we're not doing, so hopefully we're managing. And I wanted to thank you for going above and beyond with my obsession for planning our trip this time. I say all that to say to let you know that 4 years ago, on the day we met, you told me that you were going to marry me someday, and I thought you were crazy. And I have a question. Would you mind if we did not go to Australia? Because where are we saving up to go?
Australia?
And I would rather us save up for something bigger and better than Australia.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
That's on video. I love you. I love you.
It goes on and on, you get the picture. Anyway, so this is Jeff and Jeremiah. And these guys they're in Texas, they're in a community that is not particularly supportive of them. And so, this becomes a really powerful story about those parts of the country, of which there are still many, where this just isn't easy. And their story just became a big sensation. Ebony published it. It actually crashed the ACLU's site. It got so much focus. And, this is a great message for, African American audiences in this case, as we know, where the community is quite divided on this issue. It was taken all the way, all the local affiliates in Texas reported it, and these couples all over the country who've entered the contest, have been doing that work, that hard work of political and cultural change and being messages for that all over the country in places where it's really needed. So I want to draw out a few lessons from our work, and in the course of it I'll show you some quick examples and then we'll stop. Very briefly, what does all of this mean? So, these are some tips for the sort of, if you want to do the kind of movement building that we do. The first lesson is really, it's not about you. So one of the key differences in the sort of approach and style of movement building in the 21st century is that it isn't dominated by our friends here from the 20th century, right? Love them or hate them, this group, these are all kind of charismatic leaders, right? These are all people who use the bully pulpit of a large institution to run their movements. But the reality today is that movements can be much more leader-full. They can have many leaders, they can be more decentralized, and that these new tools of engagement enables you to sort of do that and make them much more self-organizing. When you think about organizations like All Out, they're not led by one charismatic leader. They're driven and very centered at the grassroots level. Secondly, and I think this is quite relevant to one of the reasons that LGBT organizing has been as effective as it has, is that the most effective organizing isn't talking dryly about issues, which is part of why environmental organizing has been largely unsuccessful in recent years, I think. It's about trying to move up this pyramid. In the ideal world, you're organizing people at the level of their own worldviews, where their deepest values are held, and those worldviews tend to really cross issues. So your position on climate change is very likely actually to correlate with your position on gay rights or your position on whether we should go to war in Iraq. And so that correlation means that if you can organize people at that level, where you're organizing them by identity, the way Avaz does, the way some of the other groups that I've been involved in starting do, it's much more effective. LGBT organizing is at that sort of identity level. I know someone who's gay, I'm gay, you know me, we have this relationship, and that becomes very powerful because the message is embodied in those stories, much the way that campaign I showed you with the ACLU does that. And so, I think this is quite relevant as well to how you think about your own work doing advocacy in the world around the issues you care about. How can you move up that pyramid? In terms of communications, I think one of the interesting shifts that's been happening is a shift from the soundbite to the meme drop. So if you think about sort of political communication, let's say in the 1990s, the great heroes were like the Karl Roves and the Alastair Campbells, the spin doctors. And what they did is they perfected the 30-second soundbite that you repeated over and over again on the television. But because media has changed so much, and there's so much more fragmentation of messages, today, if you're trying to engage people and build a movement, what's more important is to do a meme drop. What do I mean by a meme drop? A meme drop is basically where you create a set of assets, much like Occupy Wall Street. The idea of the 99%, the idea of Occupy, and you almost drop those assets on people and do that in a way that is not branded by you or owned by you. You create interesting, compelling assets that people can then remix, manipulate, make their own, run with, and propagate on your own behalf. And if you think about the most effective kind of campaigns today, there's an element of that meme drop. Whereas if you put your name all over it, your brand all over it, they're often much less likely to succeed. But memes are not enough. You need to organize for the long term. And the work we do at Purpose is not just creating little shot-in-the-dark campaigns, it's actually about building long-term infrastructure for people's participation and energy around different issues. So we've done that with gay rights with All Out. We're doing it around global inequality with an organization called The Rules. We're doing it around a whole set of issues where we identify a vertical or an issue area where there is a natural constituency, and we build that engagement over time. We build power. This is the last video I'm going to play you, and then we're going to wrap up. You also need to do the storytelling really well. And again, I think sometimes lawyers in particular fall into the habit of going, well, it's the law, end of story, right? And they sort of think that's the argument done. And that's, very rarely effective for people, unfortunately, even though you guys are all right all the time. So, so you got to also learn how to embody that in stories. This is an example of a really powerful video that was made by Get Up, a group in Australia that I co-founded, which is one of these worldview-based, broad-based social movements. And I'll just play you the video and then we can talk about it. So I think there's sort of two lessons to draw out of that video. One is, do the storytelling. That's the way to bring an issue like this to mainstream, non-gay, unconvinced audiences, because you universalize it. Secondly, this wasn't just a meme drop. It did get, 10 million views on YouTube. It was the #1 video in the world at one point on YouTube. But what was more interesting about it was that it was part of a very specific political change moment, which is that we released that ad about a week before the governing party was to vote on whether to put marriage equality in the party platform. It was a very closely fought vote. That video was a phenomenon. We raised a ton of money from our members, again in micro donations, to air the ad all over the country. The airwaves, when people were watching the cricket, were full of this ad, and we helped to win that vote. Finally, there's some very simple theory. I think sometimes people think that, in order to be an activist, you have to show deep commitment to the issue. You have to kind of have a card in your wallet that means you've joined, and you have to kind of chain yourself to the White House. And if you don't, then frankly, you're too weak. Well, that's not the way to get people engaged, right? Today, you can get people involved by asking them to take very low barrier, very simple actions. And then the methodology is to move them up that curve of engagement and to get them more involved. And all the data suggests that doing it that way, rather than having a kind of a purity test up front, results in much more deep engagement over time. Because people like to dip their toe in before they deeply commit. It's a human thing. All of the behavioral economics shows that. So when people say, oh, this is all just clicktivism, and I'm sure some of you will want to engage that debate, I think the evidence suggests otherwise when this is done well. You've got to go both transnational and hyperlocal. So there are many issues like gay rights where the solidarity exists across borders, but where you also have to show a really strong local footprint. So I'm going to stop there. It's an honour to be in the presence of the incredible Jane Huckabee. So I look forward to your questions, and we can have a discussion.
Okay, well, I have a million questions. I'm not going to abuse my moderator prerogative. I'm going to open up the floor to people who have questions. If you could identify yourself prior to asking your question, that would be great.
My name is Jay Leff. I'm a 1L. here. I guess I have a question about your distinction between identity and worldview. Especially when I think about these, we used to think a lot about something like maybe extended mind theory, where there's a certain amount of using these as exterior aids to identify who we are, but that we create the worldview through getting people to identify with this, and then to slowly take steps towards that worldview is how I would normally think about it. But you actually differentiate the two as being like very separate. So I guess my question for you is, and you clearly are establishing that you think that it's best to go for that worldview perspective or weigh in right away. And I guess why necessarily to go for that talk right away?
Yeah, I think it's not always possible to go to the worldview level. I'm really just making the point that the organizing that I've seen tends to be most effective and most scalable when you can organize at that level, but that's not always appropriate. So if you're doing LGBT rights organizing, it really belongs in that identity section. That's the lever that you're pulling. The distinction that I'm making between the two is that identity is like, the lever is your personal experience of the issue or your understanding or how it relates to who you are, right? Either I'm gay or I know someone who's gay and that connection. Worldview is more about a broader set of political and social, cultural values that you may hold. So, for example, a vase organizes people around a worldview, which is basically I'm a progressive internationalist, essentially, right? And I have a set of views that make me enlightened about, human rights and about the environment and about, sort of people's right to live and love as they choose. And those things may be in very different issue categories, and they'll include identity politics, but they'll go beyond it. And that kind of organising is more scalable, partly because you can organise people around many issues rather than just one, and then you can migrate people across. And that's not always appropriate for every task that you're trying to achieve when you're organising people, but it tends to be very effective, which is why Avaz has 35 million members and All Out has 2. The difference is that All Out's organising people around one issue and one identity, whereas Avaz is organising people around this kind of meta-identity.
Just to push the question a little bit further, I guess I'm curious if you see that in some ways as limiting who you can get involved in the movement. For instance, I'm thinking about, let's say, the movement here in the United States to raise the minimum wage right now, or income inequality movement. If we take it on the worldview, there's a lot of workers who are rural Republican voters who would never, on the worldview, come into the grouping that we're talking about. But if we do work on the identity, they can identify with, I'm making $9 an hour, something like that, and then you can use that as a way to pull them into the world.
Well, it depends on what worldview. So if you're organising, with income inequality, if you're organising people according to a worldview that's around, fairness or around decency or civility, or there may be some traditional values around which you can organise people on that issue of minimum wage. It doesn't all have to be like the lefty worldview. You know what I mean? There are different ways into that issue, but I take your point.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm actually a senior in undergrad here. But I guess I had a question about how Purpose works on bridging sort of technology gaps between working with folks in the global north who have readily available access to broadband, and working with with more impoverished communities in the global south where sort of like text technology is kind of the sort of frontier. How do you have you found ways to bring those two sort of groups together, and how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd say yes and no. So the reason that we're working on things like CrowdRing, the missed calls tool, is because we think it's really dumb just to focus on the people who have broadband. And if we don't get mobile organising right, then we just don't, we're missing a huge segment of people that we can mobilise. And I'll note that it seems that these missed calls are more effective than text messages because of this dynamic that I describe around people not wanting to pay for texts. So this missed call tool, I think, is sort of the equivalent of the email petition in a developed world context. We're building a technology platform that's supposed to bring all of that together, and it's beginning to do that, which means that if we're organising people around, let's say, Uganda and LGBT rights, we could run a missed calls campaign in Kampala, and we could also run a more traditional kind of internet-enabled campaign, in the West, and we could connect those two. So we are working on those things, but it's also fair and true that the sort of middle-class Western audiences that you mobilize are not always, they're quite different audiences, and it doesn't always make sense to kind of put them together, within the context of a single campaign.
Lilia, did you have?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Lilia. I'm a 3L here. I have two questions. The first is sort of how do you think about accountability issues in terms of sort of the communities that you're working on behalf of, and versus sort of who your funding is coming from, and sort of if there's a disconnect at times between like working on a broader issue like LGBT rights, but where maybe different segments of that group might have different priorities or something like that. And then the second, you don't have to answer both, but the second is, are there situations or issues for which you don't think storytelling is the most powerful tool, and that you would sort of look to other ways to advance sort of the community building effort?
Yeah, I think on the second question, you guys are lawyers, right? So most of you, not all of you. That's a lever, a powerful lever for social change. We see what we do as another lever, and within that, there are some variants, right? Storytelling is just part of the process. I don't think it's quite the end in itself. I think of what we're doing as movement building and building power, right? Using these kinds of techniques. So it's not always the most effective lever. So if you're trying to make social change, if you're trying to, let's say, get the Chinese government to take climate change seriously, you probably don't want to use social movements. There are probably other more effective, more elite-driven strategies there that are going to have a better and more dramatic impact. So when we think about our work, we think when is there an opportunity for impact, where a movement or that kind of intervention would actually make a difference. And where there isn't already a lot going on that's effective. So we don't intervene if there's already, a great and flourishing space in that area. We look for gaps. Or we help existing organisations like the ACLU kind of add that dimension to their work, which is often really powerful, because then you connect a traditional litigation and policy strategy to a mobilising strategy. It becomes quite powerful. On your first question, I think there are always questions of accountability. I mean, I think one of the things about this kind of work is that there's less formal, it's less institutional, and so maybe there are less safeguards in that respect. And the trade-off is you get more speed, more nimbleness, more creativity, etc. The way we keep ourselves honest is we try to hold ourselves accountable to our members, and make sure that our members support the work that we're doing, and we have mechanisms to do that. We also work very closely with groups on the ground. So in the case of All Out, we would never run a campaign in Uganda if we weren't being told by the groups on the ground that was right and appropriate at that time. So our campaigners are like journalists. They're in country or in region. They have sources, they have relationships, they have beats, they have deep understanding of the context, so they know when and how to make these interventions, which doesn't mean we always get it right, but it's certainly not a case of just kind of dreaming this stuff up from New York.
I'm with the business school next door, this is Cameron. I guess my question is more about how do you measure success, and if you would take on a project where you don't see kind of an end goal, or how do you tackle that issue, and if it plays into fundraising, how it all works?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very new field, so we don't have that many tools yet to kind of, it's also like a social sciences thing, so it's not like you can sort of measure impact the way you would if you were doing a vaccination program, but there are ways, right? So I think we see it in two categories. So one is clearly we set about to achieve certain things, and we can measure whether we achieved them. So, specifically we're trying to change laws, we're trying to change policies, we're trying to achieve measurable cultural change, which is something that you can track. Now, the causation is always hard to establish because we're usually one actor among other actors and other forces, but we can certainly look at the impact that when we launch a campaign, how did that change the trajectory of a particular debate? Then when you zoom out, the work we see is really about building power. So I think about like the group we started in Australia, GetUp. You know, we launched GetUp in 2005, and it's an incredibly powerful piece of the infrastructure now, so that we can raise millions of dollars a year for progressive causes. We can make interventions because we've got this standing army of people that were never possible before GetUp. And that has resulted in a bunch of very concrete changes. Arguably, it changed the outcome of a federal election in 2010. It certainly has changed laws. We even actually ran a court case in which we helped to bring about a constitutional change around voting rights. So, you know, it can be very, very significant. You can point to specific victories, but you also don't want to neglect the role of the infrastructure itself and how that can impact, you know, the space.
I was wondering if you take something as vague and decentralized as like the Occupy Wall Street movement, and one of the criticisms of that is it's kind of something that's really difficult to actually translate into actual kind of policy implications. And then if you juxtapose that with something like the Tea Partiers, which has a worldview as vague and decentralized as the Founding Fathers, but is really able to bring about these very concrete policy successes, how would you kind of account for and explain why the Occupy Wall Street failed so much, where the Tea Partiers have been so successful in taking over a party?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think the short answer is that both movements started out being relatively decentralized. The difference was that decentralization and that kind of meme-driven stuff works really well at a certain point in the movement, but then the movement has to consolidate in order to turn into think tanks and, you know, like PACs and all of the things you need to do that nominate candidates and do all of the things that influence the process in different ways. And the Tea Party, partly because they were always more top-down than it appeared, had all of that infrastructure. So they have like essentially a media operation, which is called Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, and they have a whole bunch of infrastructure. So that was partly a very deliberate decision they made, where they actually consolidated what began or had an element of being something that was very grassroots. Now, ideologically, the Occupy folks were kind of opposed to that. You know, they were like, no one is going to own this, no one can appropriate it. Actually, a little bit of appropriation would have been helpful. If they'd sort of let someone build the Occupy, you know, think tank and the Occupy political party and the Occupy bank and the Occupy this and that, it would have actually been more effective. But they were, you know, it was a little bit of a Monty Python Life of Brian scenario. You know, the sort of the left were very bad at getting along and doing things.
Isabella's had her hand.
I'm Isabella. I'm a 3L. Picking up on the decentralization idea, how do you see the commitment curve in high-risk environments where that consolidation actually entails a risk factor, where people simply do not want to be identified?
So it's just a different set of kind of circumstances. So this is true about gay rights work, certainly, where, you know, we obviously are not identifying people, you know, who are taking these actions, or we're protecting them. We've invested a lot in helping the group in Uganda, for example, you know, actually encrypt all of its data. So we just did this big exercise, a data security exercise with them. So, you know, it's a different context. It limits your ability sometimes to show that online kind of solidarity because of the security concerns, but those things are still happening usually face to face.
How do you define the content of your campaign, especially when you're dealing with more practical issues like changing a policy, not just a movement like Occupy Wall Street, but actually trying to provoke a more factual change? And I know that you have a lot of partnerships, so I'm curious if your team, it's more for the design strategy and telling the story, and you rely on your partners to have the legal basis or the content of the campaign.
Yeah, that's pretty right. I mean, in the sense that, like, at Purpose and with the different organizations that we've created, we don't pretend to be the deep we don't pretend to be the deep sort of policy people in the sector. So we build very close relationships. Like, the All Out team is constantly on the phone with Human Rights Watch and with other folks in the sector who have that expertise, both the grassroots groups and the international human rights groups. And I think initially, there's a bit of skepticism, like, what is this? This is scary. Is this going to take away our funding? Is this going to, all of the usual turfy NGO questions? But actually, I think once people get the value of this, because it really adds a layer that doesn't exist into these sectors, that's really powerful. The capacity to mobilize, the capacity to reframe, and the capacity to raise micro donations really matters. And then I think once people get that, the relationships are very, very constructive and positive.
Can I make
Yes?
a follow-up question? So how do you assess how right that campaign is? Like, if that's for instance, one of your partners decided to change the policy in a certain way, and how your team, how purpose will give this stamp of quality. You're helping them with your campaign, but how do you assess if that's the best solution for the problem?
Well, ultimately, we have to make the judgment. So our staff and our campaigners become experts, certainly at the broad issue, and they think about what is going to be appropriate for our members. They sometimes actually poll the membership. So every campaign we run, before we send it to the full membership, we're testing it with a subsection of our membership. So we know whether it has the support of our own members. If it doesn't have the support of our own members, we don't run it. That doesn't always mean that it's right, of course, but we start with what we think is right, and then we test it to see whether people support it, because we see ourselves as a member service organisation, and then we run the campaigns. Now, when there are questions of deep policy nuance, or two camps in our space are fighting and it's kind of a 51-49 thing, we probably don't run a campaign on that. We probably identify things that do attract that broad consensus, rather than run on the things that divide our own side. It's not where we're best placed to intervene.
I'm curious to learn more about how your work at Purpose kind of uses data as a tool to kind of drive movements, and if and when there are opportunities where data is kind of the most effective tool to driving movement.
Yeah, well, data tells us a lot about how we can optimize our work. So it means we can get a message out more effectively to more people more quickly than we would otherwise be able to do. And so we test a lot of stuff. Like, we test subject lines, we test every element of our campaigns. Our platform enables us to do that, because that enables us to do a better job of serving the people that we try to engage. So data is really important, and when you're doing these big movements that have many millions of members, you're generating a lot of it that can then help you engage people in different ways.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about your strategies in developing countries, particularly in Africa. You alluded to the fact that Western imperialism is often a barrier to some of your work, and I agree that sentiment and perspective I don't think is going anywhere, and many communities and many people in African countries tend to be quite suspicious of solutions that are coming from the West. Now, of course, you tailor the projects that you do. For instance, in the Kenya example, you had garbage collectors going door to door. But I was left wondering what happened after that. I understand that with NGOs and movements like this, a Western organization parachuting in, conducting something, and then leaving is yet another thing that contributes to that suspicion over Western-led initiatives. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about how your organization addresses those two issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into the Kenya example, because it's a good example. So we didn't start that campaign. So local groups on the ground had been trying to get traction on this for a long time. So we worked with them. So this is a group called The Rules that we set up, and The Rules is solely focused on Global South organising. So our activists, including people who are from Kenya who are on our staff, were working with the groups on the ground who were trying to move on that issue. We helped them do this reframing to the Unga tax. We brought the CrowdRing tool in. We did a lot of training work with them, but the campaign was ultimately run by them and continued. You'll notice our brand was not on that, right? It wasn't the rules. It was owned by a coalition of local groups. So, that's how we're doing it there. And in the case of the Global South organising we're doing, it's quite a different style to some of the more like global Western-oriented work that we're doing. So these are always concerns. I think on the broader sort of set of questions, there's no doubt that the Western kind of argument is going to be used, especially on issues like gay rights, like all the time. And I think on that, like, we have to be a voice. Like, that's a cynical political argument in a lot of these places. Like, it's deeply cynical when the Ugandan government or Ugandan politicians say, this is a Western disease, it's not ours. That's obviously wrong. So we have to, all we can do is make sure that the voices that we are deploying and that the voices that we're empowering are local voices, unless an outside voice is powerful. As it might be if Coca-Cola rang Museveni and said this is wrong or spoke out, that would be useful because people know that Coca-Cola is important to the, to the economy. So, you deploy international pressure when it's helpful, not when it's harmful, because the backlash problem is real. But the work that All Out's doing, is, I don't think you want to let those potential criticisms get in the way of the work if the work's right and you're doing it the right way with the right people.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a doctoral student from Brazil here at law school. The U.S. has a strong tradition of public comments ever since like the 40s for a policy action, policy decision. And then you mentioned, and with technology came the online petitions, and you mentioned the missed calls. And I was wondering if you share this perspective that these tools tend to be less effective with time, and if so, what do you think will be like the next strategies or tools that you see coming next for using the campaigns?
Yeah, they do become less effective with time, and it's more just like there are waves, right? So, in the US, the online petition as an entry point for engagement is going to become less effective over time, although it's partly just something that's mainstreaming. It's kind of a classic thing. So early adopters are now like rolling their eyes, but like ordinary Americans are getting really involved in that for the first time. So there's a cycle of like mainstreaming a behavior like that, and then the early adopters are going to take up new behaviors, and then eventually they'll mainstream. So the My Big Gay Legal Wedding campaign is a great example of how we are trying to get ahead of that. So rather than run an online petition for marriage equality in the US, which would be really boring, we create this whole engagement platform where people can vote for these couples, and the voting mechanism is the equivalent of the signature, and it gets them involved, but in a much more interesting and dynamic way.
What about gamification? Do you see this talk about using games to engage? Do you see that becoming mainstream for public campaigns?
I think that game mechanics and sort of feedback loops are really powerful. Most actual games, like these games for good, there aren't a lot of examples of them being effective, or like of them being having achieved scale. People don't really want to play games for good.
Okay, I have a quick, if you can, in 1 minute, talk about, I know that Purpose has been very involved in the Whip Syria campaign. If you could talk a little bit about that, and how your interaction with more traditional NGOs in that scenario played out.
Yeah, well, this is a very early stage. So Purpose has been asked to run an international campaign to try to reframe the Syria debate from these are all bad guys, let's avert our gaze, to this is a major international humanitarian crisis, there's an aid gap, aid can't get into the country, there's no political constituency for peace talks. So we've been asked to do that. It hasn't been easy. in the early stages, because every NGO in the world is trying to raise money off the back of Syria, and there's a lot of NGO politics. So what that really means is that we try to avoid traditional coalitions as much as we can, because coalitions, they can be really useful at very particular punctuated moments, but they're a terrible way to do movement building, because you get like really diluted lowest common denominator dynamics. Everybody has to agree, which means that nothing interesting is ever said. And movement building is about provocation and risk and creativity. And if you can't do those things, it doesn't work. So, I think with Syria work, we're moving from a place where the first stage was a kind of a coalition play, where I think we had some success. The first goal was just to get Syria in this new frame. And the With Syria campaign, the hashtag With Syria, trended in 20 countries, whereas Syria hadn't trended anywhere, from this perspective during the whole conflict. So we're beginning to do that work, but now we have to kind of we have to sort of unshackle ourselves from the constraints of the coalition a little bit.
Okay, well, I want to give you a huge thank you, Jared, for taking time out of your schedule to come and share with us all your experience. And I think you'll be available for a few minutes for questions if people have questions. And thank you, everyone, again, for your participation and coming out on such a horrible, nasty day as well in Durham. Thank you very much.
Thank you.